Hello everyone. I'm here to discuss the recent issues that the Laramie Police Department has experienced and what measures can be taken to help improve their service to the community, as well as their image and reputation. Improving relations. It sounds like Laramie PD's biggest issue is its public relations. There are a couple of different ways to improve relationships with the public. From the issues Laramie has been personally experiencing, it seems like improving transparency in the police department should be a major focus. Along with transparency, adopting methods like community-oriented policing, or COP, and evidence-based policing, or EBP, may help improve the legitimacy of the department in the public eye. Updates in regards to Laramie PD's website should also be done. Transparency. This could be improved on its own by implementing a more structured use of non-committed time. Non-committed time is the time that officers spend between calls for service. They could be doing anything from patrolling to picking up their dry cleaning. I would suggest a simple form be required to be filled out at the end of every shift with a timeline of events. Another great option to improve transparency would be the use of body cameras. The officer would be required to wear one at all times and to return to the station if any technical difficulties appear to be interrupting the feed. I would also suggest that the footage be backed up to a place that the PD is not in charge of, but we will discuss more on that later. A third way to increase transparency is to require mandated reporting. Mandated reporting is where officers are required to report any suspected corruption by fellow officers or supervisors. This would also require an open door policy in which officers could go to their supervisor's boss. If shown that an officer did not report an event that they should have, consequences including a formal write-up, suspension without pay, and even being fired should be considered. COP. What is it? COP is more broad in scope than EBP in that there is not a specific standard or criteria to apply. Laramie need not focus on all aspects of COP, but should prioritize things like citizen input, positive interactions, problem solving, and building partnerships with the community. All of these are issues that Laramie is currently struggling with. Structure and management should also be changed and monitored to create better transparency and accountability. How can we use it? Using COP methods will take time and should be done in conjunction with other forms of training. How do we implement it? Implementing COP starts with building community relations. Officers should be engaging in regular outreach with schools or other youth programs. They may even help neighborhoods organize and establish neighborhood watch programs. Any event that the community has that is geared towards the general public should have a police presence, but not in an omnipresent or controlling way. Let the people that you are there to serve, not just generate arrests. EBP, or evidence-based policing. What is it? Not only is EBP an excellent way to improve Laramie PD practices, but it ties in nicely with community-oriented policing. EBP uses a scientific method to test research ideas and programs that, if found to work, can affect policy and strategies. Using things like crime analysis, surveys, and risk assessment tools are all examples of EBP. Lum and Coper specifically describe working with the community to carry out various EBP ideas. How do we implement this? Start small when using EBP. There is a good chance that Laramie is already using it in some way, as most police departments do. Figure out the department's strengths and build from there. Update to technology and practices. Based on the recent issues that Laramie Police Department has experienced, I think that they could benefit from improving or updating current technology and practices. A large complaint from the public was the lack of an organized complaint system and lack of access to annual reports. I suggest that Laramie updates its website and puts their complaint process front and center. The form should be found online and should be easy to use. It should also be available in Laramie County's major languages. Being easy to use means that no field should be required to be filled out, and there should be a space at the end for anything that pre-written questions may have overlooked. A phone number should also be available in case the person is not literate or does not have access to a computer. Walk-in complaints should also be accepted. Every option should allow the person to remain anonymous. As for annual reports, there should be a link that allows the community to view annual reports going at least 3 years back. These should also be printed out or emailed upon request for maximum transparency. Another important topic that is not necessarily a prominent issue within the Laramie Police Department, but that is still worth a discussion, is implicit biases. What is an implicit bias? An implicit bias is something that an officer is unaware of. It could be racial, ethnic, xenophobic, or sexist. How do we make ourselves aware of our implicit biases? The good thing about implicit biases is that someone can be made aware of them and can also be given the proper tools and training to avoid letting it impact their work. What sort of training should Laramie adopt to deal with implicit biases? Implicit bias training should include testing officers to increase their awareness, as well as giving them access to methods that will reduce the likelihood that these biases will affect their policing. Remember, everyone has implicit biases, and they are not a judgment on the individual. What are the limitations of everything we've discussed so far? Let the public know that you only need time to solve each of these issues. Your biggest challenges will be funding, time, and resistance from the police department itself. Keep these things in mind when addressing issues and implementing practices. All of the previous topics went over a lot of information, so what do I recommend you do with it? Recommendation 1. My first recommendation is that City Council create a committee or board to review serious complaints about the police department. Serious would include an accusation of corruption or of an abuse of power. Citizen complaints that would be considered serious would also include anything where they felt the officer's actions were racially or ethnically motivated. A separate phone number that goes to the committee and a link to the police department's annual reports should be provided on the committee's website. Members elected to this committee should also be diverse, and they should not have a conflict of interest. No relatives of police officers, their superiors, or of current city council members should be allowed. Recommendation 2. My second recommendation relates closely to the styles of policing discussed earlier. Laramie needs to build community relations so that it can start using EBP practices. This will be very time-consuming, and a certain amount of trust and respect will need to be built using COP methods before EBP tactics can really work. If Laramie wants to research its own EBP practices, then the city needs to be informed of the complexities behind this, including the cost of EBP and its repetitive nature, as it is scientifically based. Recommendation 3. My final recommendation is the most generalized in that Laramie Police Department needs more training. I would suggest training in the following areas: the history of Laramie policing, de-escalation tactics, how to use procedural justice, and mental health first aid training with the option for officers to volunteer for CIT training. Ideally, at least 20% of the force should have CIT training. Implicit bias awareness training should also be included. De-escalation techniques include teaching officers to use the least amount of force possible in any given situation. This involves being able to solve tense situations verbally without the use of a taser or another weapon. Procedural justice couples well with implicit bias training and de-escalation. This type of policing includes training officers to be able to handle citizens with respect in tense situations, as well as towards the end of a shift when energy and morale may be running low. It also involves making unbiased decisions, and, this being the most fundamental part of procedural justice, the cop must allow the citizen to voice their side of things. Let the citizen explain why they did something or what happened that led to the police contact. Mental health, or CIT, crisis intervention teams training. This will be a training that will be easily implemented after community relationships and partnerships have been built up. CIT requires these strong partnerships so that police know if they need to handle the situation themselves or refer individuals to mental health care providers within the community. These recommendations can be thought of as an action plan. First and foremost, the police department's website should be updated to include a better complaint process. Then comes the establishment of the committee. This should preferably be up and running within a year, if doable. It should be a free election to the public, but approving citizens by council may be more feasible. Since Laramie is a small to medium-sized city, the council should include 6 to 12 members. I would suggest a 2-year term with re-election available once. Remember that this committee should be diverse and reflect Laramie's population. This committee should then create its own website and should work in conjunction with the PD to make sure that serious complaints are processed outside of the department instead of relying on Laramie's internal affairs. Next, I would implement the various trainings. Conduct a community survey and figure out what the public would most like to see. Start with the top 3 issues and set aside funding for those programs. Develop a timeline for how long these trainings should take and make this information available to the public. This will go a long way towards developing mutual respect between officers and the rest of the community. Lastly, I would have the department use EBP. While EBP may be arguably the most important, I would have council worry about it last, as it will be an ongoing process. EBP is not a single training. It should be constantly evolving to include the most scientifically based practices, and the practices that Laramie chooses to adopt should reflect the community's current needs. This means that if property crimes go up, EBP should switch its focus. If auto theft goes up, EBP should again switch its focus. This does not mean that the department should stop doing what helps the previous crime go down. This is just an example of how EBP will be ongoing as new methods are discovered and different crimes go up and down. EBP might be less intensive and more easily adopted if combined with POP, or problem-oriented policing. POP, what is it? It focuses on a single issue or problem at a time. This might be a better way for council and citizens to view EBP, even though it differs from POP, because it takes longer and requires more rigorous evaluation. Do not be afraid to copy or adopt another department's methods as long as they have scientific backing. Make tweaks to any of these recommendations or to the action plan to find the right fit for Laramie. Thank you for listening.